Before she died, my mother dispensed idioms with the mechanical consistency of a gumball machine. She offered them like pieces of stale wisdom. Their minimal flavor quickly faded. Even so, I found myself savoring them. I didn't want to relinquish the last sentiments she had to give me. Washed pots never boil, Mary. Two birds, one stone. Honey catches more flies than vinegar. At first, it was easy to pretend that the idioms were relevant to our conversations. But as she lost lucidity, they melded together and became unintelligible. Throw the baby out with the gift horse. It's time to bury the elephant in the room. Mary. I used to sit next to her in the nursing home and will myself to understand. Her tone was always urgent, her grasp fervent. She looked at me like she was begging me to comprehend nonsense. But even then, I suppose I knew what she was really telling me without voicing it. Words that I would not bear to hear even if she were capable of saying them. She was dying. Her jumbled idioms seemed to be all that remained of a once expansive vocabulary. She used to weave stories with language like a beautiful thread and her tongue as a needle. But it was as if she forgot how to sew. I imagined her dementia burrowing into her brain, chiseling out words, leaving only rot in its wake. When her disease first manifested, I deluded myself. I became convinced I could slow her decline with the right materials. I brought her daily newspapers until the incident happened. That day, I gave her the daily paper and a quick kiss on the cheek. I sank down in the stiff armchair at her bedside and shielded my eyes from the sunlight that streamed in from the window. I glanced at her venous hands and saw them tremble. The paper shook with her convulsions. I felt every muscle in my body tense as she emitted a low, warbling moan. "Mom, what is it?" I asked, but her only response was to curl further in on herself. She clutched her ancient nightgown to her chest like a small child. My heart clenched. Terrified and confused, I reached out to comfort her, to take the paper away. But she broke down sobbing. "Don't cry over book covers," she whimpered. When I finally wrestled the tear-sodden paper away from her, I read the headline, "Jenkins twins suspected to be sixth and seventh victims of backwoods butcher." After that, I only brought Debbie Macomber novels. But the damage was done. She stopped reading not long after the newspaper incident. I watched the seasons change from her room's window. As the trees shed their leaves, resplendent shades of crisp golds and browns were carried away by the wind. As far as the eye could see, the trees' skeleton limbs were left to brace the cold. Without their armor, they looked defenseless and alone. My mother lost herself in much the same way. Day by day, the color bled from her life. Her essence shed from her skin like so many dead leaves. In its absence, she was carved bare, until only a dull, unrecognizable hull remained. I tried to search her face for any semblance of selfhood, but her skeleton leered as if mortality were staking its claim. Flesh clung to her jaw and hung in jowls like the last vestiges of life clung to her frame. She was my mother, and she was death incarnate. I found that I could not look at her for long. I stared hard at the floor, my hands, the door. Anywhere but the unfamiliar gaze from the sockets sunken in my mother's face. When she sensed that my gaze had shamefully slid away, she sometimes snarled at me. "Watch pots never boil." Her frail fingers would dig into my wrist and leave imprints in my skin. I could feel her urging me to look at her, to see her diseased eyes and wispy hair and pallor skin. This is my confession, so I can admit, it was hard to visit her in the end. I found excuses to leave as early as I could, or better yet, to never come. I hated the twisted, repetitive idioms that she upheaved like a sickness. I hated the bleached smell of the nursing home. Most of all, I hated sitting next to her as an unseen but pernicious force took more and more of her away. I knew she was dying. For months, I could see it etched in her face and hear it in the absence of things she couldn't say. But then why was I left so bereft when death came like a thief in the night? I should have been relieved for her suffering to end. But all I could hear were the last words she said as they bounced around in my head. "Mary," she uttered 2 days before her end. Better late than never. I didn't hear her speak again until long after she was dead. Her funeral came and went with little fanfare. A few of my friends came from work. Most of hers were already dead. Together, we listened as a pastor we had never met described a caring creator we had never perceived. When the time came, I sprinkled dirt on her casket and watched as the gaping maw of the earth swallowed her whole. Afterward, Ethan, Jade, Allison, Sam, Nick, and I all crowded around a small bonfire as February's cold sank her teeth in our skin. I drank more than I spoke. My friends carried the conversation. When it was time for the rest to leave, Ethan didn't. I sank into his arms that night, and every night since. 1 week passed without my mother's idioms, then 2, then 3. Several months came and went. When it rained, it was a pet-free downpour. I judged books by their covers and stared at pots just long enough for them to boil. I don't know why. I just know that I felt her absence acutely, so much so that the lack of her became its own presence. My mother met an end she didn't deserve, and I couldn't find the justice in it. How was it fair for her to die alone in a nursing home, left with nothing but the few sentences she could string together, wilted flowers, and a book she could no longer read? Horribly, unforgivably, how was it fair that she became a burden to me, and I resented her for it? I hated sitting there, listening to her half of conversations decades in the past, a prisoner of her own mind, only ever lucid enough to hate me. Sometimes the grief rose and fell in crests and waves, and other times the anger ignited me. When I was angry, I would go home and set a full pot on a hot burner and wait. Just like I used to sit and wait at the nursing home for her to say anything, do anything. I was good at passive participation. I sat and watched as time elapsed and bled the life from her eyes and the love from her heart. So I did it, too, with the pots. I wish I could say I watched the water boil because I missed her, but I think the truth is that I was daring her. My own vengeful version of, "Look, Mom, no hands." A desperate, illogical call for her attention. But in all the times I called for her across a depthless void, I never actually expected her to answer. But she did. I first heard her words from Ethan's lips after the fire. I guess I left the burner on for so long and so often that I became careless. Maybe I forgot to turn it off one night after I emptied the pot of boiling water. All I know is that my house went up in flames and little was left, save for ashes. After I lost everything, I was so relieved when Ethan invited me to stay with him. Of course, I said yes. He had a charming bungalow out in the country on land his grandfather left him. Our casual fling quickly became a serious relationship. He brewed tea almost every night, and always prepared mine with plenty of honey. As my mother would say, living with Ethan was a silver lining. Or that's how it felt until she decided to join us. 2 weeks ago, my mother spoke to me. But I didn't know it at the time. As Ethan set my mug down on the coffee table, I looked into his deep blue eyes. "Thank you," I said. "Hey, do you mind grabbing a blanket?" "Sure thing, love." He brushed a curl behind my ear and walked to the doorway before suddenly turning back. He stood there in the doorway for a few minutes, unmoving, as if in a trance. I felt his eyes on me and raised mine only to meet his vacant stare. He was looking through me. His brow was furrowed. "I thought I told you watch pots never boil." The voice that left his lips was not his. Nor was it hers. Not really. It was something else. Inhuman. A death rattle wheeze that formed the shape of words in the absence of inflection. I did not hear it so much as I felt it, a chill that twirled around my spine and tightened. I felt this entity and instantly became clammy and nauseous. I could not speak. My mouth was filled with ashes. "Honey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan came out of it, crouched before me, and gently reached for my hands. Finally, my throat unclogged and words spilled out. "What do you mean? Why did you say, 'Watch pots never boil'?" I said. I searched his gaze but only saw our shared confusion. I didn't say anything. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" He inspected me with concern. I both believed him and didn't. I knew that those words couldn't be his. But then why did they leave his lips? At first, nothing came of it. I wish I could say that this was the end of it. But it was only the beginning. That voice. I heard that voice more times than I care to admit. The words were always my mother's, but the voice was not of this earth. It was devoid of humanity. It lacked light, love, or warmth. At times, I believed that my mother was speaking to me across a great distance, and maybe the bone-chilling voice was interference. Other times, I was convinced that Ethan was pranking me. It was easier and safer to think my boyfriend was an asshole than it was to think we were being haunted by my mother. But even then, I could not shake my terror. Every day, just as my defenses lowered, that nauseating voice would surface from the grave of his lips and permeate the air. Hours ago, it said, 2 birds, 1 stone, 2 birds, 1 stone, 2 birds, 1 stone, 2 birds, 1 stone, 2 birds, 1 stone. It was a chant, and it was a condemnation. I could not hear the anger, but I could feel it suffusing the words and contaminating our home. "Ethan, what the fuck is going on with you?" I pushed him in the chest and was shocked as his head cracked back against the wall. It was like his body went lax, like his form was hollow and the voice was an abscess. Let her off the hook. The words were carried by a rapid hiss from between his cracked lips. I shuddered as the temperature plummeted. Who? I choked out. I could feel the shift as Ethan returned to his senses. He rubbed his head. Mary, what happened? Why are you looking at me like that? Ethan, I can't. This isn't funny. You need to stop, I pleaded. Mary, I don't know what you're talking about. My head is pounding. I'm going to lay down for a minute. Okay? Flabbergasted, I watched as he walked away and shook off the urge to beg him to stay with me. Needed to get to the bottom of the voice. If my boyfriend had a shitty sense of humor, then okay. But we would talk about it like adults. Things had gone too far. So I went in search of Tylenol for his headache. Like my mother always said, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. I searched high and low in cabinets and drawers and turned up empty. It seemed like I found everything but Tylenol. I was almost ready to give up, but then I remembered his guest bathroom cabinet. I felt around inside a drawer when my fingers brushed against two thin metal chains. I pulled them out and held them up to the light. They were curious things, two thin strands, each with a single bird charm dangling. They looked familiar in a way I couldn't place. Did Ethan have family stay in this room? His mom or sisters? As I studied them, my heart began to race. 2 birds, 1 stone. Surely, that was a coincidence. I wanted to put them back in the drawer, close it, and forget about it. But even as I thought it, I felt a compulsion to keep them. Some unknown instinct was nudging me almost imperceptibly. The necklaces looked so innocent, the type of jewelry that children wear. With sudden clarity, I knew where I had seen them before. Of almost its own volition, I felt my hand reach for my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out, unlocked it, and stared at the home screen, unblinking. I typed into the Google bar, Jenkins twins disappeared. My heart sank. The girls were gone, but their necklaces remained. It couldn't be, could it? But the necklaces were a perfect match to the ones the girls wore in the article's picture. Why else would Ethan have 2 children's necklaces in here? Frantically, I Googled backwoods butcher. There had been 2 additional suspected victims since the day I gave my mother that paper. My mind raced as I searched for Ethan's alibis and came up empty. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the police, but I needed to think. Honey, where are you? Ethan called from the hallway. I panicked and put the necklaces back in the drawer before closing it quietly. I was desperate to confront him, but my mother's words rang in my head. Let her off the hook. I thought about all the things she said, before and after she was dead. That whole time I thought she was stuck in conversations in the past. But what if she somehow knew about the future? Watched pots never boil. What if she knew about the fire? If I had paid more attention to the burner, then the fire would never have happened. 2 birds, 1 stone. I thought about the necklaces as nausea crept up my throat. Let her off the hook. My pulse raced. What does it mean? Is it literal? Who is she? And more importantly, where is she? Should I follow him to find out?
I don't know if I should be posting this, but screw it, it's been over 20 years, and no one ever believed me anyway. Maybe someone out there can explain what I saw that night. Back in 2003, I worked security at a government-funded research site. Not gonna say where, but let's just say it was out in the middle of nowhere, far enough that if something went wrong, no one would hear the screams. The facility was a fortress, barbed wire, keycard access everywhere, armed patrols at night. Most of the time, it was boring. Scientists came in, scientists left, and we were just there to make sure nobody messed with their work. But there was one project that always gave me the creeps. They called it Project Chimera. Even the other guards didn't know much about it, just that it involved biological stuff and that the scientists working on it never looked well rested. It was a quiet night shift. I was doing my usual rounds, walking the perimeter of the high-security labs. Then my radio crackled. Containment breach in Lab 3. Non-human interference. I remember thinking, what the hell does that mean? It wasn't unauthorized personnel. It wasn't security risk. It was non-human. I ran toward Lab 3, and when I got there, I saw 2 scientists standing outside, looking absolutely terrified. Through the glass observation window, I saw it, a deer. A goddamn deer was standing inside the secured laboratories, right in the middle of all their high-tech equipment, its hooves tapping against the floor. It looked wrong. Not sick, not injured. Just wrong. Its movements were jerky, its breathing was too slow. Its eyes were milky white, and I swear to God, for a second, I thought it was looking directly at me. One of the scientists, Dr. Nakamura, I think, was practically hyperventilating. She kept muttering something like, "It's interacting with the Matrix. This wasn't supposed to happen." Then the lights flickered. And everything went to hell. There was this low humming noise, like a power station warming up, but deeper, more alive. The air felt thick, like walking through syrup. The deer just stood there, its body twitching slightly, and the machines around it started sparking. Then, for a split second, it wasn't a deer anymore. I don't know how to explain it. It was still there, but its shape was warping, like it was being pulled apart and put back together at the same time. I could see other things inside it. Patterns. Shapes that didn't belong in a living creature. The scientists were screaming at each other, trying to shut the system down. I grabbed my radio and yelled, "We have a serious problem in Lab 3. But the second I said that, the deer snapped its head toward me so fast I heard its neck crack. And then it was gone. No explosion, no dramatic escape, just gone, like someone had flicked a switch and erased it from reality. The humming stopped. The machines went dead. The air felt normal again. They shut down the lab immediately. The higher-ups came in the next morning, cleared everything out, and told us not to ask questions. I overheard one of the researchers whispering that they found something left behind where the deer had been standing, a residue, some kind of organic material that didn't match anything they had on record. But no one ever explained what happened to the deer. They told us it was a security failure, that the deer had somehow wandered in through a ventilation shaft, which was bullshit, because I had walked that perimeter for months, and there was no way a full-grown deer made it past all that security. A few weeks later, Project Chimera was shut down completely. The lab was sealed off, and the lead researchers were reassigned or just disappeared. I put in my resignation not long after. But sometimes, I still dream about that night. About the way the air felt wrong. About the deer's eyes, milky white, staring straight through me. And the way, for just a second, I swear it knew what I was thinking. I assume, very confused woman called in what would likely become a drunken disorderly charge just after midnight. She told the county police department that a freak in a BDSM suit staggered out of the forest and passed out next to her front gate. My co-workers picked short straws and Tyler lost, so was sent to pick this freak up. I was busy filing paperwork when they brought him in, and turned on a little music to try and drown out the commotion. Eventually, Tyler staggered into my office. "Chief, come look at this weirdo," he said, before ducking back out. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Tyler was a good deputy, but he had the maturity of a high schooler sometimes. I capped my pen, wiped the ink smudges off my fingers with a tissue, and stood up, my knees popping in protest. The office was cramped, barely big enough for the desk and filing cabinet, and I had to sidestep a precarious stack of case files to get to the door. I walked through the lobby and unlocked the door which led to the holding cells. I saw a group of just about everyone who isn't on patrol at the time crowded around the door to the drunk tank. There was a low buzz of conversation, occasionally pierced by a burst of laughter. I elbowed past them to the front, where Clarice was filming the guy with her phone. I was about to tell her to knock it off when I actually got a good look at him. At first, I thought Tyler had been exaggerating. He wasn't. The man slumped against the back wall of the holding cell looked like something from a grainy video nasty. His outfit, if you could call it that, was a skin-tight, jet black suit that covered everything. No zippers, no seams, no indication of how the hell he got into it. It had a weird sheen under the flickering fluorescent lights, which made me guess it was latex. His arms ended in stumps. There was a polished, metal circle attached to the face of the suit approximately where the mouth should have been. At first, I thought 2 eye holes had been cut in the material. Looking closer, I realized that they were spaced too far apart, with the left one being elevated ever so slightly more than the right one. "Tyler," I turned to my deputy, "did you get a good look at his eyes? Dilated pupils." "Actually, those aren't his eyes. No, they're fake. Old prosthetics I think." "Enamel," replied Tyler. Clarice kept filming. I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "Clarice, put the damn phone away." She huffed but did as she was told. The rest of the staff muttered amongst themselves, shifting uncomfortably. No one was more uncomfortable than Jack. Old Jack spends more nights in that drunk tank that he does at home. That's probably his aim. This night, he was reported howling at women younger than his daughter, and was picked up staggering down Main Street rattling his empty bottle of homemade gin against the lampposts. Now he was curled up in a ball in the corner of the cell, sitting in a puddle of his own piss while swearing in Spanish at the latex man. I turned to Tyler. "Where'd you find this guy?" "Near the Banks house, you know, where the Maggot Farm murders took place in the 90s. He was face down in the dirt, completely out of it." Tyler crossed his arms. "We tried talking to him, but he hasn't said a word. Thought he was on something." I glanced back at the guy. His chest rose and fell slowly. You searched him? Tyler shook his head. No pockets. I sighed. All right. Let's process him, see if we can get an ID. Tyler gave me a "you're the boss" shrug and grabbed the keys off his belt. He stepped toward the cell and the man moved. Not much. Just a twitch. A slight tilt of the head. When I looked at him again, he was staring right at me with his porcelain eyes. Old Jack whimpered and Tyler looked back at me. I gave him a nod that told him to keep going. Then he stood up. He looked inebriated. He found his unsure footing and stood to look at us, then back at Jack, then to us again. His suit squealed with each movement. Clarice let out a choked gasp as he lumbered towards the door. I felt a sudden, unbearable pressure in my skull, like an ice pick was being driven through my forehead. I bent double, hands on my head, and groaned like a pained cat. At first, I thought I was feeling the beginnings of a cluster headache. I've suffered from them since childhood, and spent most of my life trying to articulate how painful they are to friends and family, and employers. They are the only comparison to what I felt in that moment. Then, I looked up and saw that the dozen people around me were reeling from the same such pain. Then, in a voice that was neither deep nor high, neither man nor woman, the figure finally spoke. Where am I? With those words, the pain ended. The thing's words rang hollow in my mind, and, I'm sure, in the minds of the staff who surrounded me. I slowly collected myself and stood up straight, facing the thing in the cell. You're in the county sheriff's office, I said. Who are you? The thing tilted his head down, considering the question. It seemed to stare at its fingerless hands before answering. I do not know, it said. The voice wasn't muffled. I exchanged a nervous glance with Tyler. All right, I said slowly, trying to keep things calm. How about you tell us what you do remember? How'd you end up where you did tonight? The thing brought its latex mittens to its face, stroking its own cheeks. I remember, darkness. A great weight. Then, freedom. But not mine, it communicated. Its words were like tin, and I continued to hear them longer than I should have. It was clear to me now that it wasn't speaking. We were hearing its thoughts. Okay, I continued carefully. Do you have a name? Anything we can call you? Aleph, it answered in an aggressive tone. It took a step back, and then another. It stood in the center of the cell, surveying us. From behind him, old Jack whispered something to himself about the devil, and spat on the concrete floor. Slowly, Aleph turned to face him. Jack looked startled, but his intoxicated rambling continued. He stopped mid-sentence while swearing to God, and began to splutter and wheeze. Jack, I called, grabbing the wheel of keys from Tyler. Jack, stay calm. I'm coming in. As I fiddled with the lock, my co-workers around me gasped. I looked up to see Jack slowly rising, his back grinding against the wall behind him. He clawed at his throat as he fought for one more breath. Aleph stood and watched his dying agony, silently content. Jack was standing on the tips of his shoes now and then, nothing. As he was suspended in midair, hung from an invisible noose, the door to the cell clicked open. Jack's body crumpled to the floor and the latex man rotated, facing me once again. Before I could issue a warning, it began to glide across the floor. Startled, I reached instinctively for the gun in my holster. As I did, my arm snapped forward at the elbow, shattering the joint. As Jack had done, I fell to the floor, clutching the bulging, splintered bone just under the skin. Pathetically, I started to cry as I watched the man in latex float past through the door. My deputy and close friend for a decade, Tyler, drew his pistol and leveled it at that thing's head. I watched helplessly as his hands moved backwards, clearly out of his control. Tears welled in his eyes and he pleaded as he pressed the barrel against his forehead. I could see that he was trying to fight it, but it was useless. The gunshot was deafening. I woke up an unknowable amount of time later. I staggered to my fight, holding onto the bars for support. I realized that I had passed out from the pain, but my arm still throbbed like a second heartbeat. I picked up my fallen gun and slid it back into my holster. I looked around and saw my colleagues. They were scattered on the hall's floor. Slowly, I made my way out of the cell. The bodies that surrounded me looked like they had been run over. Crushed. I tried to look at the ceiling as I walked over them, feeling the remains separate with each step. It was like walking through mud. Finally, I broke free into the main hallway. It was a nightmare. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows over the crumpled forms of my colleagues. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. My shattered arm hung uselessly at my side, each step sending waves of nauseating pain through my body. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to keep moving. I had to get out. I had to find help. But as I stumbled toward the lobby, I realized something was wrong. The station was silent. No radios crackling, no phones ringing, no casual conversation between work friends. Just the faint buzz of the dying lights and the occasional drip of blood hitting the floor. Hello. I called out, my voice trembling. Is anyone there? More silence. I pushed through the door to the lobby, and my heart sank. The front desk was overturned. Papers and broken equipment scattered across the floor. The windows were intact, but the world outside was wrong. The streetlights were dim, their glow muted and hazy, as if the light itself was being swallowed by the darkness. The trees beyond the parking lot swayed unnaturally, and gradually drained into the darkness beyond them like a wet, watercolor painting. And then I saw it. Aleph was standing in the middle of the parking lot, its back to me. It was perfectly still, its glossy suit reflecting the faint light in distorted patterns. I froze, my hand instinctively going to my holster, but I stopped myself. I couldn't risk it. Not after what had happened to Tyler. What are you? I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'd limped out into the tarmac of the parking lot now, just yards away from Aleph. When I spoke, it slowly turned around. I saw that it was desperately trying to open the metal hatch over its mouth. Defeated, it lowered its arms back down to its side. I'm dreaming, it said. The words slithered into my skull like a snake, wet and oily. In my periphery, I could see the night sky lower itself. The darkness spread, and seemed to move like a sandstorm. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my heart. My knees buckled and I fell to the floor, clutching my chest. When I looked back up, I saw nothing. True nothing. Surrounding me was the void. It went on forever in every conceivable direction. The only two things in this universe were me and Aleph. What? I said between rasping breaths, what is this? It is me, replied Aleph. After a short eternity of silence, it spoke again. I need to find the other dreamers. The silence of the void wasn't silent at all. It was a low, insectile hum, vibrating in my molars, and in the marrow of my shattered arm. Aleph stood before me, his porcelain eyes reflecting nothing and everything. A void in a void. His mittened hand hovered inches from my face, the black latex glistening like the carapace of some deep-sea fish. I tried to speak, to scream, but my tongue sat dead in my mouth. Then the sirens came. Not from outside, but from all around. A shrill, electronic wail that seemed to peel the darkness itself into ribbons. Aleph's head snapped upward, his metal mouthpiece emitting a sound like a detuned radio. The void shuddered, reality folding like wet paper, and suddenly I was on my back on cracked asphalt. The parking lot's yellowed overhead lights buzzed and flickered. My broken arm pulsed in time with them. The SUVs arrived in a synchronized swarm, black and sleek like a posse of hearses. They skidded into formation, boxing us in with military precision. Doors flew open. Men in charcoal gray suits spilled out, their faces obscured by gas masks tinted amber. Their gloves were thick and rubbery, with the same unsettling sheen as Aleph's suit. Aleph didn't move, didn't say anything. All around me, I heard men's voices barking orders into radios, and receiving them twofold. The agents raised devices that looked like overgrown tasers, their prongs crackling with blue current. Aleph's head tilted, almost curious. Then he raised his stumped arm. The nearest SUV levitated. Not dramatically. Not like movie magic. It's just, unweighted, tires spinning lazily as it drifted 6 feet off the ground. The agents froze. One muttered into his comms, voice tinny through the mask, "Asset is active, I repeat, the asset is." Aleph snapped his arm back down to its side. The SUV crumpled like a beer can, windshield exploding in a diamond spray. It hung there, a mangled sculpture, before crashing down. Agents dove clear, but one wasn't fast enough. The chassis pinned his legs, his scream muffled by the mask. Chaos erupted. Tasers fired, arcs of blue light in the dark. The currents struck Aleph, and wriggled around him like neon snakes. They had little effect on it. 2 agents collided midair, bones crunching. I scrambled backward, gravel biting my palms. That's when I saw him. A man in a cream-colored trench coat, untouched by the bedlam. He clutched a white rabbit, its fur carefully dyed red. The creature's nose twitched, its eyes wide and alive. "Aleph," the man called, his voice a reedy monotone. Aleph froze. A suited man collapsed from the air, mid-vivisection, and the tension that blanketed the area dissipated like a deflating balloon. Aleph turned, slow and jerky, toward the rabbit. The trench-coated man stepped forward, extending the animal like an offering. Aleph reached for it neatly, its mitts trembling. When it touched the rabbit, the red dye smeared onto its latex, spreading in uneven streaks. The creature didn't struggle. It just stared, its breathing rapid but steady. The man in the trench coat smiled. It didn't touch his eyes. "Good," he murmured. "Back to the garden, little king." Then he drew a pistol from his coat, an unremarkable, modern handgun. He put a consoling hand on Aleph's shoulder and walked behind it. He flicked the safety off the pistol and pressed it against the back of Aleph's head as it lovingly cradled the rabbit like a newborn. The gunshot was deafening. Aleph didn't collapse dramatically. It just slumped, like a marionette with its strings cut. Its suit lost its sheen, turning dull and lifeless. The porcelain eyes stared blankly at nothing. No blood poured from the wound. The trench-coated man knelt, carefully taking the rabbit back into his hands. He touched Aleph's face and whispered something. Medics rushed to my side, their gloves cold as they strapped me to a stretcher. I didn't take my eyes off Aleph. His body lay motionless, the latex suit now just a strange, empty shell. The man in the trench coat watched as agents began loading Aleph into a black body bag. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Soon after, I passed out from exhaustion. The last thing I remembered was being carried into the back of a van. When I did finally wake, I was laying on my own sofa, in my own living room, in my own house. I sat up, disoriented, and almost had a heart attack when someone spoke from just behind me. I turned to see the man in the trench coat sitting across from me. We spoke briefly and he leaned across my coffee table to hand me a pen and a clipboard. Attached to it was a lengthy form that he told me to sign. It was a non-disclosure agreement. I asked him what would happen if I didn't, and he just stared at me. Eventually, I reluctantly picked up the pen and wrote my signature on the dotted line. The man in the trench coat cracked a smile and stood up, patting me on the shoulder. He told me that he'd be in touch, and calmly strolled out of my home. He never did get in touch again. The feds swarmed the ruined police station like flies on shit. I, of course, was the last to be told what they were doing. The story that covered the local news broadcast for a few weeks was that a gang had shot the place up. Yet another unfortunate battle lost in the war against drugs. I had a teenage daughter and a beautiful wife at the time, and all I wanted was to keep my head down. I took early retirement and tried to keep away from the press. Eventually, they stopped caring. See, this all took place in 2009. Since then, my daughter has grown up to follow in my wake, and is now the town's sheriff. I've kept myself to myself, never telling anyone about that night. I live a quiet life now, and enjoy my retirement. But a few weeks ago, I began to have dreams. Not since I was a young boy could I remember my dream. They'd manifest as the tiniest sliver of memory, if anything. At the start of this year, my dream became so vivid. It's almost painful. Each night since I've had the same dream of a red rabbit, trying to lead me deep into the forest. Tonight, I think I'll try to follow it. I am posting here to share my recollection of events that have left myself and several of my co-workers frazzled, to say the least. As the title suggests, my manager had a spinal infection that spread to her brain, causing immense swelling of her brain's tissues. She was hospitalized in a coma for 6 weeks because of it. When she returned to work, all of us were very grateful for her recovery, especially once we saw that she seemed basically normal. Prior to her return to work, she sent out an email, warning all of us that she might be a little slow to get back to her normal production levels and that she may be prone to some odd behavior. Her doctor told her that it is completely normal for her to experience strange moments of subtle mania or depression, and that she shouldn't be too worried about it, and to let the moments pass as they come, but to contact them if they get worse or prolong in duration. For some context, I work as the sales manager in a major retail store selling musical instruments. I am the first person people contact when the typical Karen asks to speak to our manager. My boss, Helen, is above me. She usually doesn't deal with petty sales but focuses on major shipping manifests, communicating with the higher-ups about sales projections and statistics, as well as interceding on our behalf to the powers that run this company. She is a wonderful boss and all of us, as I said earlier, were ecstatic she was cleared by the doctor as having a full recovery. That was all 3 months ago, before what my co-workers and I have begun calling her brain swell moments started to happen. Helen insisted to us that her doctor cleared her. But as time went on, suspicion began to rise amongst our ranks in the sales team. Because of the nature of our collective experiences, we decided we needed more than professional help to diagnose what Helen's problems really were. Reddit was our vote. The first brain swell moment occurred 3 weeks after Helen's return to work. Until this time, everything appeared just as it always has, relatively mundane, repetitive, work. She acted her normal self and even surprised us one Friday with a cake, thanking us all for our patience and support through her medical trauma. She was so proud of the cake she had made. I spent all night baking the cake and preparing the frosting. I even watched a YouTube video about how to make fondant. She said, slicing and handing out pieces of the baked treat to us all. It wasn't myself who noticed it, but my coworker, Nathan, who saw what she wrote on the cake wasn't exactly correct. He pointed it out to me after all of us had devoured our portions gleefully, and it said, "We are grateful for your prayers." She must have just slipped and wrote "we" instead of "I." Her doctor did say she would have moments like this. I expressed to Nathan, attempting to ease his worry. I don't know, man, she never made mistakes like that before. Remember when Stacy misspelled a customer's last name on that order slip and like 100 shipping labels? She made her reprint it. Nathan said. Well, yeah, but what she's gone through has been life-altering. Her brain will never be the same as it was before. Besides, she said it was her first time making fondant. She probably spent all that time making it, only to realize after the fact that she had the wrong words. I think anyone would be too tired to change it. I really thought Nathan was making a big deal out of nothing. But I'll admit, she was certainly not her usual self. The Helen I remember from when I first got this position was straightforward, exacting, and precise. She knew what she wanted and how to get there, and she wanted to take us all along with her. Now she mostly seemed despondent, far off and isolated. I would walk into her office, looking for a signature on some major order forms, only to find her gazing out her window. Her eyes, unblinking when I saw her face, legs twitching slightly as if she was about to fall asleep. Still, I chalked it all up to the spinal infection and brain swelling. After all, she wasn't hurting anyone. Until her second brain swell moment. That one was recounted to me by our newest team member who has since found employment elsewhere. His name is Scott, and he is a naive 18-year-old who loves playing guitar. He started working for us just after Helen had gone to the hospital for a fever, back pain, and muscle spasms, the symptoms that indicated to the doctor her growing spinal infection. Scott didn't get a chance to see who Helen really was or how she actually conducted herself at work. He only saw the aftermath. On a Monday, in the following month after the cake incident, Scott came in for his late shift, noon until 8:39 p.m. I was in my office and the rest of our sales team was either out to lunch or on the floor, 4 people including Scott. Helen had been on lunch when he clocked in. The time clock is by the break room, allowing young Scott a quick glance at what Helen was snacking on. He saw her eating, as he described it, severely burned popcorn. Black as sin with lots of little pieces breaking off as she ate. Looked like it was her first time eating a snack, she was making such a mess. He had chuckled when he mentioned it to me. We shrugged it off as simple weirdness, then he left to go fulfill his duties. A couple hours into the shift, when business was slowest, Scott did what he did every day and began cleaning the products we had on display. When that was finished, he would make sure all the guitars were in tune. We all knew it was an excuse to play at work, but I let it slide as he always made sure his work was finished before he did so. As he finished dusting off a nice antique Fender we had on display, he plugged it into a nearby amp, set the volume low and began serenading the empty sales floor with melodic vibrations. He was a talented kid, full of expression and creativity that showed when he played. That was another reason why I let him play during the afternoon lull. It was a nice break from the incessant pop music our bosses demanded we play over the speakers. I had leaned back in my office chair, enjoying the free concert when the music was cut short. I lifted my head and listened intently but heard nothing. A stray customer probably wandered in. Scott wasn't allowed to jam while customers were here, that was probably it. I just went back to my work. A moment after I refocused on my paperwork, I heard Scott howling. His shrieks reverberated down the hallway into my office. I jumped up from my desk, knocking my chair over, and ran down the hall to the floor. When I got there, the screaming had ceased and Helen was straightening her shirt while she marched past me down the hall into her office. Scott was standing in the corner of the floor by the guitars, pale as a ghost. I didn't notice until I got closer that his shirt was covered in vomit. He had brown bile mixed with black chunks all over his torso. What happened, Scott? I heard a lot of yelling. Where is everybody? I said, taking notice the sales floor was void of anyone save for us two. He stared at the space Helen last occupied before she had disappeared down the hall. After several moments he responded, she. His eyes began to well up. He closed them, shook his head, pushed me aside and walked purposefully out the door. He never came back to work. I couldn't piece together what happened with the evidence I had at the time. Was Scott drinking and got sick on the job? Did he have an anxiety attack after getting in trouble with Helen? But why would she have been mad? She never got mad before. I didn't think a brain injury would make someone hate music that much. It was probably just one of her episodes, I told myself as I began cleaning up the mess. I put the Fender back on display, thankfully there were no fluids on it, and went to the supply closet to grab a mop, bucket, and some gloves. When I came back and started mopping, I saw some beetles had already begun crawling all over the fresh vomit. Where the hell did you come from? I knelt down, picked them up, and threw them away. Disgusting. Scott texted me that night that he quit. I called him in response to the text, which I know is annoying, but I had to figure out what happened. He, surprisingly, picked up. He said he was in the middle of playing when he felt her hands slide down his shoulders towards his chest. He froze for a moment, then whipped his head around to look at who was touching him. She was glaring at me, man. She looked wicked fucking mad. But at the same time, she was grinning. What do you mean, grinning? I thought you said she was angry. Her eyes looked angry, and red, like she had smoked way too much weed, or something. But her mouth was smiling, like really big. I could hear his shudder through the phone. What happened next? Did she say anything to you? Static answered me. I had begun to think Scott had hung up when his voice came through. She spoke to me, but I didn't hear it. He said with finality, quickly, like it was difficult to say. I paused. What? She spoke to me, but I didn't hear it. His emphasis confused me. How could someone speak to someone without them hearing it? Scott continued, she said we have dreamed of your presence. I thought she was messing with me, but when I stood to face her, she was looking right through me. What are you talking about? I insisted. She just stood there, man, shaking and staring at me, but it looked like she was looking past me, or at something right behind me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I felt too afraid. Like if I told my legs to move, they wouldn't have listened anyways. What the fuck? Was all I could say. She kept repeating that sentence again and again and again. She must have said it over 100 times. But Jack, her lips weren't moving. He made a sound that seemed like he cut himself off. Then she fucking puked on me, man. He continued, why did it take you so long to get out there? I came as soon as I heard yelling, Scott. I don't know, man, it felt like a long time. Her puke too, it wasn't normal. What do you mean, wasn't normal? It had beetles in it, Jack. Fucking bugs. How could she have done any of this? According to her, the doctor said mild manic and depressive episodes may occur. How does any of this fall under those categories? What did Scott mean by she spoke to him but he didn't hear it? Why did her vomit have bugs in it? I realized then that I had to contact her doctor. Jack, I gotta go to bed, man. My back is killing me and my legs are twitching. Scott interrupted my spiral and my eyes grew wide. Good night, Jack. Scott hung up before I could say anything further, and he hasn't returned my calls or texts since that night. From what he told me, he was starting to have the same symptoms Helen had. Reeling from the implications of the conversation I just had, I barely slept. I couldn't keep myself from dwelling on it. I had resolved to call her emergency contact tomorrow morning. I would inform them of Helen's relapse in condition and, hopefully, they can take care of her. The next morning, after looking through some paperwork, I couldn't find anything for an emergency contact for Helen. She did tell me which hospital she went to though. I thought maybe I could contact her doctor directly. I stole away into my office and left the lights off and the blinds drawn. I wanted to make this call privately. After a quick search online, I found the number for the neurology department of the hospital she went to and gave them a call. Clinic, neurology department, how can I help you? Hello, yes, my name is Jack S. and I am calling on behalf of my boss Helen. She was recently discharged from your department after a spinal infection that had spread to her brain. I was wondering if you could connect me to her doctor. I can't allow you any of her medical history, sir. I know that. I don't need her medical history, I just... Sir, the receptionist prodded. I'm sorry. Helen has just been acting very strange, to put it mildly, ever since she has come back. I just would like to inform her doctor. I don't want her condition to worsen. The receptionist had me leave my information after I recounted what had transpired and said she would tell Helen's doctor I called. This type of behavior isn't typical. I would suggest bringing her to an emergency hospital. When I had left my office, Helen was just coming into work. She was coming down the hallway to our offices when I stopped her and asked if I could have a word. Once in her office, I asked her about what happened with Scott yesterday. Oh, yeah. She chuckled, sitting down in her chair and gesturing for me to sit across from her. I refused her invitation, thinking it would maintain the seriousness of the situation. Shrugging off my stubbornness, she replied, I had an exotic snack that my cousin had sent me from her trip overseas. She leaned forward and whispered, they were chocolate-coated beetles. She covered her mouth and giggled like a schoolgirl. I winced. They're totally edible. My cousin said the locals there enjoy cuisine like that all the time. It just didn't agree with me. I meant to apologize to Scott, poor kid, but I was too nauseous to speak. Rather than throw up all over him again, I just walked away. To say I was taken back was finite compared to how I actually felt. How could she pass this off so easily? Helen, I called your doctor's office this morning and they said you should be going to an emergency room right now. I sternly looked into her eyes, half telling, half pleading with her. Oh PFFT. I'm fine. I promise, Jack. I swear it was just the weird snack. I'll tell you what, if I vomit again, in the next week, I'll go back to the hospital, okay? She didn't vomit that week. Or the week after that either. In fact, she acted so normal it was almost suspicious. Was I reading into this too much? Making a mountain out of a molehill. Vomiting after a traumatic brain injury is definitely a sign of further or continuing damage, but could it have been as simple as a weird snack? This flirted with the line of concern. But after all, you can lead a horse to water. Nothing happened with Helen after that for another month. She came in at the regular time and conceded to leaving early the first 2 weeks after the vomiting incident. She even sent an apology and gift card to Scott. I told you she was a thoughtful boss. Just when I, and my co-workers, started to believe we could add the craziness to our backlog of entertaining work stories, Helen had another moment. This time the swelling seemed to have been at its greatest thus far. Helen had been working all day that Thursday, much longer than her prescribed 5-hour days for 3 months to allow time for readjustment. She clocked in with me at 6 in the morning for the first shift. Managers clock in early then leave around 2:33 p.m. depending on workload or how long their lunch takes. She spent the whole day in her office. And after periodically checking on her throughout the day, I didn't see any evidence of her acting strange. I left around the typical time, but noticed Helen's car was still in the parking lot. I had decided it wasn't worth the effort and that she knew her body better than anyone. I got in my car and drove home. 5 hours later I got a phone call from Stacy, one of our sales team members. She was in hysterics. Jack. Stacy, what's wrong? I don't know what the fuck just happened, but Helen needs some help. She cried. What happened? Wait, are you and Helen still at work? She was there when I left 20 minutes ago. By that math she had been there for around 14 hours, nearly triple her recommended work time. She insisted on double-checking our sales history for the time she had been gone to make sure it was up to snuff. Stacy mimicked Helen's voice. Why? Stacy cut me off. I went into her office after we had shut down all the lights and wrapped up for the day, and Jack, Stacy took a deep shaking breath in an attempt to calm herself. When I walked in there she was squatting on her desk barefoot, staring at her hands. Her entire body was vibrating. The whole place was a mess with papers and manila folders, broken glass, and it reeked. She didn't seem to notice me when I walked in, but when I looked back at her after looking at the mess, she was glaring at me. Stacy cried again. Jesus Christ, what? I know, it sounds crazy. But Jack, she was smiling at me too. Her eyes looked so angry, but her mouth was in the biggest smile I had seen on her face since she brought that stupid cake she made. What happened next? Did you say anything to her? No, she shouted at me and said, "Didn't your parents teach you to knock, you little cunt?" And started throwing shit at me. Oh my god. I'm so sorry, Stacy. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. She didn't hurt me or anything. Just scared the shit out of me, that's all. Stacy seemed to be calming down soon. Her eyes too. They were extremely bloodshot. Jesus Christ. Okay. Is there anything else you can remember? No, that was all that happened. Okay, well, thank you for contacting me. I'm sorry she did that to you. I know her doctor said she would have some moments, but I didn't expect anything like this. Why don't you take tomorrow off? Okay. Is Helen still at work? Okay, Jack, thank you. I don't know, she was there when I left. Thanks again for calling, Stacy. I'll go back and see if she's still there. I am ashamed to say that it took me much longer than I would like to admit to go back to work. I know that I should have gone as soon as I hung up the phone with Stacy, but I was just too scared. I didn't get paid enough for this, nor was this in my job description. Still, my parents raised me better, taught me to be compassionate and patient with people as much as possible, to always lend a helping hand if and when I am able. This was on the border of my abilities and far past my willingness. Eventually I mustered up the nerve to go back to the office. To my shameful thankfulness, Helen wasn't there. I went inside and saw nothing out of the ordinary up front in sales. However, her office was a war zone. Papers were strewn everywhere. Her desk, decorations, writing utensils, framed family pictures, were thrown and shattered all over the floor. Even her ceiling light had been ripped down and broken. And the air itself seemed thick with a rancid stench, as if I had walked into a steam room filled with cattle. All of this is unsettling at the least, but what cemented me in my resolve to get Helen to the doctor was scrawled on the underside of her desk. Written in a reddish-brown mixture, that was the source of the stench, was the phrase, "We have awaited your arrival." I couldn't smoke a joint big enough when I got home after that. I called out of work the next day, a Friday, allowing me time to reflect on what was going on and to contact my co-workers over the weekend. Those conversations are what led to this post. If anyone here knows what could explain Helen's behavior, please let me know. I am at a loss for what to do.